Ladies and gentlemen,
Good evening.
Are you ready?
Okay, here we go.
You're listening to the Deal Room Podcast. Join us as we bring you the inside scoop on business sales and acquisitions. Get across trends in the area and hear the industry's best recount their real-life tips, traps, and experiences. Now, here's your host, Joanna Oakey.
Hi, it's Joanna Oakey here, and welcome back to the Deal Room Podcast. The podcast proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. Now, in this episode, we're doing something different. I'm not actually talking. We've been playing with AI and wanted to showcase some of the incredible things we've seen it do, and what better way to do that than with a podcast. So in this episode, you'll hear from two AI hosts. Yes, they're American. I know there's an American accent, and we live here in Australia. Ignore the accent, however, and just tune into some of these examples of what AI is capable of doing right now. Really interesting. We are in a time of rapid development. Of course, the Australian accents will be here for this AI, but in time, probably sooner rather than later. But for now, we have them covering a key chapter of my book, Buy, Grow, Exit, to give you a little bit of an insight into not just the book itself, but also to what AI is capable of right now and what it will be doing. So check out the show notes if you haven't got a copy of my book just yet. In that, you'll hear our AI host talk through my take on 3 key phases of a deal and common risks in each. That's the pre-sale phase, the transaction phase, and the post-transaction phase. We'll also talk about restraints and striking a balance between protection and flexibility, and also give a high-level overview of how warranties and indemnities work. Now, remember, this is my ideas, but our AI hosts taking my words and creating a podcast out of it. So I thought it was really interesting the way they did it. Hopefully you do too. I'd be really interested in your comments on this. And of course, if any of this, so the use of AI, or indeed any of the things that our AI hosts are talking about, sparks your interest, we have a business broker working group coming up. If you're a business broker, obviously it might be relevant. If you're not, probably won't be. But in that working group, we'll be covering whitewashes and also doing an update on AI, the tools we're using, what's working and what's not, as well as how you might be able to use it right now. So check out the show notes for the link to register. I can't wait to hear what you will think of this one. So without further ado, here we go with the Deal Room Podcast, AI edition.
Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are going to be talking all about selling a business. More specifically, how to do that with as little risk as possible.
Minimizing that risk.
Yeah.
And maximizing those returns.
Exactly. And to help us with all of that, we have Joanna Oakey's book, Buy, Grow, Exit.
Now, she is an M&A lawyer, which means she's been in the trenches, she knows what works, she knows what doesn't, and she lays out a really clear plan.
Well, let's get right to it then. Oakey breaks down the sale process into these 3 phases. Pre-sale, the actual transaction itself, and then that post-sale period where a lot of people don't realize the risks can actually continue.
Oh, yeah. You're not out of the woods just because the papers are signed.
So let's start with those pre-sale risks. What really stood out to you there?
I think one of the biggest and most common mistakes is what Oakey calls taking your eye off the ball.
What does she mean by that? Getting so caught up in the sale that you forget to actually run the business.
Exactly. And that can really backfire. You're so busy with due diligence and meeting with potential buyers that suddenly your sales are slipping or your customer service is suffering.
And of course, buyers are going to notice that, right?
Oh, yeah. They're going to either get spooked and walk away, or they're going to use it as leverage to lower the price.
And if you have an earnout in your agreement where you get paid based on future performance, that could really come back to bite you.
Oh, yeah. And Oakey has this great story in the book about her client, Ted, who ran into a major pre-sale issue.
Oh, yeah. What happened with Ted?
Ted had built his business relying a lot on contractors.
Okay. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Right.
But when a buyer started looking closely, they got really worried about worker misclassification.
So they thought maybe some of those contractors should have been classified as employees.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which could open Ted up to all sorts of liabilities, back taxes, you name it.
So what happened? Did the deal fall apart?
It almost did. The buyer said, "Look, Ted, you've got 2 weeks to reclassify those 300 contractors as employees or we're walking away."
Oh, man. That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, it was a total scramble. But luckily, he had a good relationship with his contractors and he was able to make it work.
Talk about a close call.
Yeah.
But it just goes to show you why it's so important to identify any potential issues before you even start thinking about selling.
Couldn't agree more. And that includes things like reviewing all your contracts, especially employment agreement.
Making sure everything is up to date and in order.
Yes, because buyers are going to comb through every single detail looking for red flags.
It's like giving your business a full legal and financial checkup.
Exactly. And don't forget about personal guarantees. If you've signed any of those over the years for leases or loans, try to get them removed before you start negotiating.
Oh, because if those are still in place, you could be personally liable even after you sell the business.
Exactly. It's a really important thing to consider. And you know what else? Oki really stresses the importance of vetting your buyers.
Oh, like doing background checks and really making sure they're legitimate.
Yes. Don't just assume that someone who flashes a lot of cash is trustworthy.
Makes sense. She actually tells a pretty scary story about a serial con artist who almost bought a $14 million business.
The seller was about to sign the deal when they decided to do some last-minute digging. Thank goodness they did.
Oh, wow. What happened?
Turns out the guy had a long history of shady business practices and fraud. He was a total wolf in sheep's clothing.
Yikes. Okay, so we've covered some of the pre-sale risks, but even once you found a buyer and you're ready to move forward, the transaction itself can be pretty risky, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a complex process with a lot of legal intricacies, and if you're not careful, you could end up in a real mess.
But what kind of mess are we talking about?
One thing to watch out for are contracts with what are called change of control clauses.
Okay, and what are those?
They basically state that if the ownership of the business changes, it could trigger a breach of the contract.
So you could end up violating an agreement simply by selling the business.
Exactly. And that could lead to all sorts of legal headaches and financial penalties. So it's really important to identify those clauses early on and figure out how to deal with them.
Okay, so we've got change of control clauses. What else do we need to be careful about during this transaction phase?
Employee transitions are another big one. You need to be really mindful of how the sale will impact your staff.
Because if the buyer isn't planning to keep all your employees on, what happens to the ones who are let go?
They could potentially claim redundancy pay from you, the seller.
If after the sale has gone through.
Exactly. So it's crucial to have clear agreements with the buyer about how they're going to handle those transitions. And you might even want to include indemnities in the sale contract to protect yourself from any potential liabilities.
Indemnities. That's definitely something I need to talk to my lawyer about. Anything else we should be aware of during this phase?
Oki also mentions handling sensitive information carefully during the sale. You're dealing with financial records, customer lists, employee data, all sorts of confidential stuff.
And you need to make sure you're complying with all the privacy laws and confidentiality agreements.
Exactly. One wrong move could land you in hot water.
Okay, so to recap the transaction phase, we've got to watch out for change of control clauses, figure out those employee transitions, and handle all confidential information very carefully.
You got it. And it's really important to have a good M&A lawyer on your side to help you navigate all of this.
Absolutely. They can really be your advocate and guide throughout the entire process. Now, we've talked about the pre-sale risks and the risks during the transaction itself, but you mentioned earlier that the risks don't just disappear once the deal is done.
Even after you've walked away from the business, there are still things that can come back to haunt you.
Like what? Give me an example.
Warranties are a big word.
Warranties, like when you buy a TV and it comes with a 1-year warranty.
It's a similar concept, but on a much larger scale. In this case, warranties are promises that you as the seller are making about the business.
So if it turns out that there are hidden problems or undisclosed issues, the buyer could come after you even after you've sold the business.
Exactly. And those post-sale warranty claims can be very expensive. That's why Oki emphasizes the importance of careful disclosure.
So it's all about being upfront and honest with the buyer.
Let's just say it's in your best interest to be as transparent as possible. She actually talks about a court case where a business was sold for $10 million. But the seller failed to disclose that a big chunk of the projected revenue was based on a government funding program that wasn't actually going to happen.
Oh, no. What happened?
The buyer sued for misleading and deceptive conduct and breach of warranty, and the court awarded them $3.5 million in damages.
Ouch. That's a hefty price to pay for not being completely transparent. So what's the lesson here?
Don't make promises you can't keep. And if you are providing warranties, make sure you're absolutely confident in their accuracy. Transparency and attention to detail are absolutely crucial.
Okay, noted. Honesty, transparency, meticulousness part.
Yeah.
Got it. But even with all that, are there any other strategies that sellers can use to try to minimize the risk of those post-sale warranty claims?
Oh, there are. And we are going to dive into all of that right now.
I meant now, there are no breaks in this deep dive.
Yeah.
We're diving right in. What else does Oki recommend?
So besides that comprehensive disclosure we talked about, sellers can also negotiate specific limitations on those warranties.
Okay, so what kind of limitations are we talking about?
For example, you might say that you're only warranting things that were within your control or that you knew about at the time of the sale.
If something unexpected happens after you sell the business,
Yeah.
you're not on the hook for that.
Exactly. You're basically saying, I'm standing behind what I know, but I can't predict the future.
That makes sense. Are there any other ways to limit that exposure?
Oh, yeah. There are actually quite a few. In addition to specific limitations, sellers can also negotiate overall liability caps.
Okay, and what are those?
Those are basically a ceiling on how much the buyer can claim under the warranties.
So no matter what happens, the maximum amount you could be liable for.
Exactly. It could be a fixed dollar amount or a percentage of the sale price, but it just gives you some peace of mind.
Okay, so we've got limitations, liability caps. What else?
Time limits are another important one.
Okay, so instead of those warranties hanging over your head forever, you can set a specific time frame for when the buyer can make a claim.
That's right. So it's like a statute of limitations for warranty claims.
It gives you some closure. You're not constantly wondering if somebody's going to come back to bite you.
Exactly. And speaking of things coming back to bite you, Oki also talks about step-in rights.
Now, I remember seeing that term in the book, but can you remind me what those are all about?
Step-in rights basically give the seller the ability to intervene if a warranty claim does arise.
Oh, so instead of the buyer just handling it on their own and potentially making things worse, you as the seller can step in and try to manage the situation.
Exactly. It gives you some control over the outcome,
Yeah.
and it can help to protect the reputation of the business you built.
Can you give me like a real-world example of how that might work?
Sure. Let's say there's a warranty claim related to a product line that you sold. Maybe there was a defect that wasn't disclosed, and now customers are demanding refunds. With step-in rights, you could potentially step in and negotiate a settlement with those customers directly.
Oh, I see. So maybe you could offer them replacements or discounts to try to smooth things over.
It could save everyone a lot of time, money, and stress.
That's a really interesting concept. It's like having a safety net.
It is. And on top of step-in rights, you can also negotiate specific exclusions within those warranties.
What kind of exclusions are we talking about?
You might exclude claims arising from changes in law, for example, or things that were already accounted for in the financial statements.
Okay, so you're basically drawing a line around what you're willing to be held responsible for.
Exactly. And of course, Oki strongly advises against making any warranties about future performance.
Because you can't predict the future.
Exactly. So focus on what you can control and be upfront about any potential risks that you're aware of.
Solid advice. She also mentions insurance as a way to manage those post-sale risks.
Oh, yeah. Warranty insurance is becoming more and more common these days.
Really? So it's like insurance for your warranties.
Exactly. And it can give you a lot of peace of mind knowing that you're protected if a claim does come up.
That makes sense. So we've talked about a lot of strategies for managing those warranty risks. Disclosure limitations, liability caps, time limits, step-in rights exclusions, and even insurance. But warranties aren't the only post-sale risk that sellers need to be aware of, right?
That's right. Oki also talks about something called restraints.
Okay, what are those?
Restraints are basically clauses in the sale agreement that restrict you as the seller from doing certain things after the sale.
Okay, so what kind of things are we talking about?
The most common restraint is a non-compete clause.
So that would prevent you from starting a similar business or going to work for a competitor.
Exactly. And that's to protect the buyer's investment, to make sure you're not going to turn around and immediately compete with them.
I get that, but it also seems like that could be pretty restrictive for the seller. What if their circumstances change or they have a new business idea down the road?
That's a really good point. And Oki definitely acknowledges that restraints need to be carefully considered. She's seen cases where sellers agree to really broad restraints and then later regret it when their plans change.
So what's the takeaway for sellers? How do you strike that balance between protecting the buyer and also maintaining some flexibility for yourself?
I think the key is to really think long and hard about any restraints you agree to. Don't just blindly accept whatever the buyer proposes. Make sure those restraints are reasonable in terms of scope and duration.
Like how long they last and what exactly they prevent you from doing.
Exactly. You want to make sure you have at least some wiggle room down the road.
Wiggle room is always good. Now, you know what else Oki mentioned that I thought was really interesting? The issue of existing contracts.
Oh, yeah. Those can be a real headache. Even after you've sold the business, those agreements that you signed years ago can still come back to haunt you.
That doesn't seem very fair. Why should sellers be responsible for contracts after they've exited the business?
It all comes down to how those contracts are transferred to the buyer. And Oki talks about two important legal terms: assignment and novation.
Okay, legal jargon alert. Can you break those down for me?
Sure. So an assignment is basically transferring the benefits of a contract to the buyer.
Okay, so if you have a lease for your office space, you would assign that lease to the buyer.
Exactly. But here's the thing. While the buyer gets the benefit of the lease, the seller might still be legally responsible if they don't make those rent payments.
So the buyer gets to enjoy the space, but the seller could still be on the hook if things go wrong.
And that's where a novation comes in. A novation is a much cleaner break. It involves all the parties, the seller, the buyer, and the other party to the contract, and both the benefits and the obligations are transferred to the buyer.
So in our lease example, that would mean the landlord would agree to release you from the lease and enter into a new lease agreement with the buyer.
Exactly. So with a novation, you're completely off the hook.
Okay, so a novation sounds like the ideal scenario, but I imagine it's not always that easy to get everyone on board, right?
You're right. Sometimes the other party might not be willing to agree to a novation. And in those cases, an assignment might be the only option.
So it's a trade-off. A novation is cleaner but might be harder to achieve. An assignment is easier but leaves you with more potential risk.
Exactly. And for smaller businesses, there's also the option of just having the buyer enter into entirely new contracts for things like services or supplies.
Oh, I see. So you bypass the whole assignment novation issue altogether.
But that only works if the existing agreements don't involve any major ongoing obligations.
Like a long-term lease or something like that?
Exactly. Now you know what keeps coming up in all these discussions, those personal guarantees.
Oh, yeah. We talked about them in the pre-sale context.
Yeah.
But they can also cause problems after the sale, right?
Oh, absolutely. And Oki says that personal guarantees can create post-sale risk in two main ways.
Okay, let's hear it.
So first, a buyer might require you as the seller to provide personal guarantees as part of the sale agreement itself.
Even though the company's the one being sold.
It's especially common when the selling entity is a company. The buyer wants to know that they have recourse against the individuals behind the company if something goes wrong.
So it's like an extra layer of protection for the buyer.
Exactly. And sellers might be understandably hesitant to put their personal assets on the line like that.
For sure. So is there any way to avoid giving those personal guarantees?
Sometimes you can negotiate to have a portion of the sale price held back in escrow as security for any potential warranty claims.
So the buyer has access to those funds if there's a problem, but they don't have to go after your personal assets.
Exactly. It's a way to balance the risk.
Okay, so that's one way personal guarantees can be a problem after the sale. What's the other way?
The other way is if you have pre-existing guarantees from running your business that haven't been properly dealt with as part of the sale.
Oh, like those guarantees you might have given for leases or loans?
Exactly. And the problem is that if the buyer defaults on those obligations down the line, you as a former owner who gave those guarantees could still be held liable.
Even though you don't own the business anymore.
That's right. So it's incredibly important to make sure that any pre-existing personal guarantees are addressed during the sale process.
You want to make sure you're completely released from those obligations.
Exactly. Otherwise, you could find yourself in a legal battle years after you've moved on.
That sounds like a nightmare.
It can be. So having a good lawyer on your team to help you sort all of that out is absolutely essential.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from pre-sale prep to transaction troubles and all those post-sale pitfalls. What are some of the key takeaways you've gotten from Oki's book? What's the main message that comes through all of this?
It's really about understanding that selling a business isn't just a transaction. It's a process.
It's not just about signing on the dotted line. There's a lot of strategy involved, a lot of planning.
Exactly. And one of Oki's biggest points is that you can't just wing it. You need to have a plan.
And that planning starts way before you're actually ready to sell, right?
Absolutely. It starts with that pre-sale preparation, making sure your business is in the best possible shape to attract buyers.
So it's not just about making yourself look good on paper. It's about actually having a solid foundation.
Exactly. It's about reviewing your contracts, making sure your financials are in order, addressing any potential legal issues.
And another thing that really struck me was the importance of choosing the right buyer.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just about getting the highest price. It's about finding someone who's a good fit for your business.
Someone who shares your values and vision.
Exactly. Because if you sell to the wrong person, it can really backfire.
Even if you get a great price up front, you might regret it down the road if the buyer runs the business into the ground.
Absolutely. And once you've found the right buyer and you're ready to move forward with the sale, that's when it's really crucial to have a good lawyer on your side.
Because that transaction phase can get pretty complicated, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
There are a lot of moving parts, a lot of legal documents to review, and you want to make sure you understand everything you're signing.
And a good lawyer can also help you with things like employee transitions and handling confidential information.
Exactly. They can be your advocate and guide throughout the entire process. And even after the sale is complete, the risks don't just disappear.
We talked about those post-sale risks, those warranties and restraints.
Exactly. And those can be a real headache if you're not careful.
So it's important to really understand those terms and negotiate them carefully.
Absolutely. Don't just blindly accept whatever the buyer proposes. Make sure you're comfortable with the level of risk you're taking on.
And of course, if you have any doubts or questions, talk to your lawyer.
Always a good idea. To sum it all up, selling a business is a complex process. It's not something to be taken lightly.
But with careful planning and the right guidance, it can be a really rewarding experience.
Absolutely. You can walk away with a nice chunk of change and the satisfaction of knowing that you built something successful.
And you can move on to that next chapter of your life with confidence.
Exactly. If you're thinking about selling your business, start preparing now. The more prepared you are, the smoother the process will be.
Said. That is some great advice. And on that note, we want to leave you with this final thought. Imagine you've just successfully sold your business. You've mitigated the risks, and you're ready for that next adventure. What does it look like? What are you going to do with all that newfound freedom? Until next time, happy selling.
Well, that's it for this episode of the Deal Room podcast. We hope you're now primed for your next deal with these pointers and have enjoyed these fascinating insights. Now, if you'd like more information about this topic, then head over to our website at thedealroompodcast.com, where you'll be able to download a transcript of this episode, as well as access any contact details and any other additional information we referred to in today's podcast. Now, if you'd like to get in contact with our guests today and the services they offer, you can go ahead and check out our show notes for a link right through to them and their details. You can also book in directly with our legals at Aspect Legal if you'd like to soundboard your next steps, discuss a legal question, or find out more how we can assist, whether that's with buying or selling a business, or perhaps somewhere in between. Now, don't forget to subscribe to the Deal Room podcast on your favourite podcast player to get notifications whenever a new episode is out. We'd also love to hear your feedback, so please leave us a review and rating if you're already one of our subscribers, or even if you're listening to this podcast for the very first time. Every review helps our team produce valuable content for you. Well, thanks again for listening in. You've been listening to Joanna Oakey and the Deal Room podcast, a podcast proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. See you next time.
Ladies and gentlemen.
That will conclude this evening's entertainment.
Thanks for listening to the Deal Room podcast. To find out more about this episode and other episodes in the series, check out the show notes or head over to our website at thedealroompodcast.com.au.